few years ago, my wife and I decided to move out of the cramped city apartment we had been living in. With our third child on the way, the place felt even smaller than before, with baby gear, toys, and the general chaos of family life overwhelming every corner. It was time for a change, so we found a house in the suburbs, a quiet, safe neighborhood where people said you could leave your doors unlocked without worrying. The house wasn't huge, but an upgrade from our old place. One feature that stood out to my wife was the backyard. It had a lovely garden, though a bit overgrown, and scattered throughout the greenery were a few old statues. They were weathered and honestly kind of eerie looking. They reminded me of something from Game of Thrones or some ancient castle. My wife loved them though. She said they gave the yard character. To me, it didn't matter much. I wasn't going to be the one working in the garden, so I was happy to leave it as it was, statues and all. But a few days after moving in, I was standing by the window, gazing at the backyard, when I noticed something odd. One of the statues, an angel I think, was facing away from the house. All the others were facing towards the house, so it looked strange. I could have sworn they were all facing the same direction when we first moved in, but I wasn't sure. It wasn't something that I thought about much, so I shrugged it off and figured I was just misremembering. The next morning, I looked out the window again. This time, another statue had turned around, facing away from the house. I knew something wasn't right. My heart dropped, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I asked my wife about it, but she just shrugged it off, not noticing anything unusual. I considered asking our son, Jimmy. He was a little prankster back then, always up to something. But when I did, he just stared at me like I was crazy. He swore he hadn't touched the statues, and honestly, I doubted it. He had his moments, but this was different. I knew something was going on. I could feel it in my gut, but I couldn't prove it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I tried to ignore it. There were bigger things to worry about anyway. Money was tight, and I lived in constant fear of losing my job. It was a stressful time, and I didn't need to add anything else to the pile. A few days passed without any further incidents, and I started to relax a bit. But then one evening, I looked out the window again. My heart nearly stopped. All the statues were lined up in a row at the very edge of the yard, just standing there. It was like something out of a horror movie. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I could swear I felt their eyes on me. My breath caught, and I couldn't decide if it was more terrifying or bizarre. My instinct screamed that something was wrong. I didn't know what to do. I went outside to investigate, trying to make sense of it all. The yard was still and quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I took a few nervous glances around the yard before opening the door. It was daylight, but I felt paranoid and on edge. I stepped outside and walked toward the statues, trying to figure out how they'd moved. As I reached out to touch one of the statues, I realized something that made my blood run cold. These things were heavy, way too heavy for one person to move on their own. I couldn't even budge one of them. It didn't make sense. I stood there, unsure of what to do, when my wife came outside. The look on her face said it all. She was just as freaked out as I was. She suggested it might be the neighbors, trying to mess with us, playing a prank on the new people. But that didn't make sense. We had met all our neighbors, and they all seemed perfectly normal. No one would do something like this to a family with young children. This wasn't just a prank. It felt like harassment. We called the police, but, as expected, they didn't have much to go on. They suggested installing security cameras, but we didn't have the money for that. I told them we'd consider it, but I felt reluctant. It just seemed like overkill. The police left, and I guess I felt a little better, but my wife was still shaken up. We didn't want to scare the kids, so we kept everything quiet. We tried to forget about it, hoping it was just some weird misunderstanding or prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I passed a window, I half expected to see one of the statues turned in a different direction. It's an unsettling feeling, not knowing if you're safe in your own home. A few days passed, and I began to relax again. Maybe it was over, I thought. The house started to feel like home again. I was wrong. It was a weekend. I think it was Saturday or Sunday, since the kids didn't have school. After breakfast, I took the kids outside to play in the yard. That's when I saw it. Spray painted in big black letters on the back wall of the house were the words, "Go away." My heart dropped. I nearly dropped my son in shock. Without thinking, I rushed my kids inside, telling my wife to keep them in the house. I don't know what came over me, but I was suddenly filled with rage. I sprinted through the garden, shouting threats, looking for whoever had done this. Adrenaline coursed through me. I was looking for a fight, but no one was in the yard. The only sound was my heavy breathing. I started to feel stupid for running around like that. I walked back toward the house, and that's when the fear kicked in. This wasn't some stupid prank. Someone had been trying to send us a message, go away. I called the police again, but there wasn't much they could do. They took another report, but with no leads. They didn't have much to go on. They suggested that it might be the work of some teenage delinquents. That made me furious. This was more than just some kids messing around. I insisted that they keep a patrol officer nearby, but they told me they didn't have the resources. My wife was beside herself, begging me to move somewhere else, but we couldn't afford that. That night, while I was in the kitchen, I heard my wife scream. I ran into the living room, and she was standing by the window, pointing outside. My stomach dropped. 5 people were standing in our backyard, all wearing white face coverings. They were moving in strange, jerky motions, almost like puppets being controlled by invisible strings. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. I didn't know what they were doing, but it was the most disturbing thing I had ever witnessed. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find, practically yelling at my wife to call the police. At that moment, I wasn't thinking clearly. I ran outside with the knife in my hand, screaming at them, but I stopped dead in my tracks. There were 5 of them. They could be armed. I turned and ran back inside the house, terrified. The knife must have scared them because they stopped moving and ran into the garden, out of sight. I told my wife to get the kids and hide upstairs. I stood by the back door, ready to protect them if those people tried to break in. The police arrived, but by the time they got there, the intruders were gone. The police searched the property but found no trace of them. Nothing. That was the last straw. I didn't care about the cost. The next day, I installed security cameras around the property. I couldn't take it anymore. My wife was hysterical for weeks after that, begging me to let us move. I told her that if one more thing happened, we'd leave. But moving wasn't an option, not financially. Fortunately, the cameras seemed to have done the trick. We never saw those people again, and we never had another incident. But the scariest part, we still live in the same house, and to this day, we never got an explanation for what happened. I'll never forget that feeling of not being safe in my own home. And I don't think I'll ever be able to fully shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. The summer I turned 12, my family moved to rural Louisiana. My dad had just landed a new job, and we were leaving behind the busy, noisy suburbs for a slower, quieter life in the countryside. At the time, I wasn't thrilled. The thought of leaving behind my friends, my school, and everything I knew made me uneasy. But my parents kept insisting it would be good for us, a fresh start. I wasn't so sure, but I had little say in the matter. The house we moved into was old, a 2-story wooden structure that creaked with every step and groaned under the weight of the wind. It sat on a large plot of land surrounded by thick woods that stretched as far as the eye could see. There were no other houses in sight, just trees and more trees. My dad said the nearest neighbor was about half a mile down the road, but we'd rarely see them. It was the kind of place that made you feel isolated, like the world outside didn't exist. The first few days passed uneventfully. We unpacked our things, settled into our new rooms, and tried to adjust to the silence that seemed to hang over the place like a heavy blanket. At night, the quiet was almost unbearable. There was no distant hum of traffic, no chatter from neighbors, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of the old house. But soon things started to change. It began with our dog Rusty. Rusty was a big golden retriever, friendly and playful, always wagging his tail and begging for belly rubs. But after we moved, he became a different dog. He was nervous, jumpy, always on edge. He would sit by the window, staring out into the woods with his ears perked up, as if he were listening for something. At night, he would bark long, deep barks that echoed through the house, waking us all up. At first, my parents thought it was just the new environment. Rusty was adjusting to the unfamiliar sounds and smells, they said. But as the days passed, his behavior only got worse. He would refuse to go outside at night, his tail tucked between his legs, and he would growl at the slightest sound. My dad tried to calm him down, saying it was just animals in the woods, but I could tell he was starting to get worried too. That's when we met Carl. It was a Saturday morning when he showed up. My dad and I were outside working on the fence that ran along the edge of our property when we saw a figure approaching from the road. At first, I thought it was just one of the workers who had helped us move in, but as he got closer, I realized I didn't recognize him. Carl was an older man, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with gray hair that was thinning at the top and a face that had never too much sun. He wore a faded plaid shirt and jeans that were frayed at the hems. He walked with a slight limp, but what struck me most were his eyes, pale blue, almost gray, and sharp like they were always watching, always calculating. "Morning," he said, his voice rough like gravel. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be the new folks." "That's right," my dad replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just moved in last week. I'm John and this is my son." Carl nodded, his gaze flicking to me for just a second before settling back on my dad. "My name's Carl. Live down the road a bit. Thought I'd come by and say hello." "Nice to meet you," my dad said, extending a hand. Carl shook it, but there was something off about the way he did it. Too firm, too quick, like he was just going through the motions. His eyes darted around the yard, taking in everything, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something. Interest? Curiosity, maybe even hunger. You folks settling in, all right?" Carl asked, still looking around. "Yeah, we're getting there," my dad said, forcing a smile. "The house needs a bit of work, but it's a nice place." Carl nodded, his eyes finally resting on me. "Y'all be careful out here. These woods can be tricky, especially for kids." There was something in the way he said it that made my skin crawl, but I didn't say anything. I just stood there, feeling his gaze on me like a weight. My dad must have sensed my discomfort because he quickly changed the subject, asking Carl about the area, the neighbors, and the best places to go for groceries. Carl answered all the questions, but there was something strange about the way he talked. His sentences were clipped, his words carefully chosen, like he was hiding something. After a few minutes, Carl said his goodbyes and limped back down the road. My dad and I watched him go, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief when he finally disappeared from view. But that relief didn't last long. That evening, my dad pulled me aside, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "I need you to listen to me, son," he said, his voice low. "I don't want you going anywhere near that man." "You hear me?" I frowned, confused. Why? He seemed nice enough. My dad shook his head, his jaw tightening. "There's something off about him. I can't explain it, but I don't trust him, and I don't want you getting mixed up with him." "Understand." I nodded, but the unease in my stomach only grew. My dad wasn't the kind of person to get spooked easily, and seeing him this concerned made me worry even more. That night, Rusty started barking again, louder, more frantic than ever. He was pacing back and forth in front of the window, his ears flat against his head, growling at something outside. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop. His eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. I peered out the window, but all I could see were the trees swaying in the wind, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the yard. There was nothing out there, at least nothing I could see, but Rusty knew something was there, and whatever it was, it terrified him. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Carl's face, those cold, calculating eyes staring back at me. I kept hearing his voice in my head telling me to be careful and warning me about the woods. And every time I thought of him, a chill ran down my spine. A few days later, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone whispering outside my window. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. Someone was out there, just outside my window, whispering my name. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I wanted to call for my parents, but I was too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. And then I heard it again, my name whispered in that same rough, gravelly voice. "Carl." I forced myself to sit up, my hands trembling as I reached for the curtain. Slowly, I pulled it back just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Carl was standing in the yard, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. But there was something wrong with him. His skin was ashen, his eyes hollow, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. He was staring right at me, his head tilted to the side like he was trying to figure out what I was thinking. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on his. The fear paralyzed me, and then suddenly he was gone. I don't know how he moved so quickly, but in the blink of an eye, he had vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the lingering sense of dread that hung in the air like a thick fog. I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room, my heart racing as I banged on their door. My dad opened it, his face groggy with sleep, but when he saw the look on my face, he woke up fast. "What is it?" he asked, his voice urgent. "Carl," I stammered. "He was outside. He was right outside my window." My dad didn't waste any time. He grabbed the shotgun he kept under the bed and hurried downstairs, motioning for me to stay close behind him. We checked every door and every window, but there was no sign of Carl. The yard was empty. The woods were silent, but I knew what I had seen, and so did my dad. The next day, my dad started asking around, trying to find out more about Carl. But the more he asked, the stranger things got. None of the neighbors knew who Carl was. There was no record of anyone named Carl living in the area. No one matched his description. My dad even went to the local police, but they didn't have anything on him either. It was like Carl didn't exist. That night, my parents sat me down and told me we were moving. They didn't give me a reason, but I knew it had everything to do with Carl. The next few days were a blur of packing and planning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see Carl standing there, that twisted grin on his face, those hollow eyes. The day I first bought the duplex in Portland, Oregon, in July 2021, I thought I had made the perfect investment. As a 30-year-old IT technician, I had spent years saving for a property where I could live comfortably while renting out the second unit to cover expenses. The duplex checked all the boxes: a quiet neighborhood, a reasonable price, and just enough charm to make it feel like home. I moved into the upstairs unit while I worked on prepping the downstairs for renters. It needed some paint, new flooring, and a few plumbing fixes, but nothing I couldn't handle. My days were split between my IT job and working on the downstairs unit. At first, everything seemed fine. The house stayed pretty quiet during the day, and I figured any strange sounds were just part of its old charm. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing things that didn't add up. It began with subtle sounds at night, while I was upstairs watching TV or reading. I'd hear noises coming from the downstairs unit, a low thump here, a faint creak there. Initially, I chalked it up to an old house doing old house things, maybe even a critter passing through. After all, it was an older building. But the noises started happening more often, and each time they felt a little harder to dismiss. One night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the downstairs hallway. They weren't loud, but they were deliberate, one after another, moving from one end of the unit to the other. I froze, listening intently. My first thought was that someone had broken in. Heart racing, I grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed downstairs, my hand shaking as I held the handle. But when I opened the door, the downstairs unit was empty. The doors were locked, the windows were closed, and nothing seemed out of place. I double-checked everything, even the crawlspace access in the utility room, which I hadn't touched since moving in. It was sealed tight. Convinced I was imagining things, I went back upstairs. Over the next week, the noises continued. During the day, the downstairs unit was silent, but at night it came alive. Footsteps, soft thuds, and occasionally the faint sound of something dragging across the floor. Each time I went to check, I found nothing. It started to mess with my head. I'd lie awake, straining to hear even the smallest sound, my mind running through possibilities. Was it squatters or some kind of animal? Or something else entirely? One evening, determined to figure it out, I decided to stay up late and see if I could catch whoever or whatever was behind the chaos. I turned off the lights and sat by the window overlooking the duplex's front door. Hours passed and nothing happened. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it again, the distinct sound of a chair scraping against the floor. I bolted downstairs and swung the door open, but the unit was dark and still. I checked every room, my pulse quickening as I approached the utility room. This time, the crawlspace access panel was slightly ajar. My gut twisted as I bent down to inspect it. It looked like it had been opened recently. Dust and debris littered the floor around it, and faint smudges on the edges suggested it had been used repeatedly. The next morning, I called a friend who worked in construction to help me inspect the crawlspace. Together, we pried open the access panel and shone our flashlights inside. The crawl space was larger than I expected, running beneath the entire house and connecting the two units. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the low ceiling forced us to crawl on our hands and knees. As we moved farther in, the flashlight lit up something that made my stomach drop. A makeshift bed, blankets, a pillow, and even a few personal items, a water bottle, an old paperback book, and a half-eaten bag of chips, were scattered around. Someone had been living there. We crawled farther, following the narrow space, until we reached a small opening that led up to the closet in the downstairs unit. The access panel had been carefully cut and was hidden behind a row of coats left by the previous owner. It was the perfect hiding spot, completely invisible unless you knew where to look. I was horrified. Whoever had been living there could move freely between the crawl space and the downstairs unit without being detected. Worse, they could have easily accessed my unit if they wanted to. The thought of someone silently moving beneath my feet while I slept made my skin crawl. My friend and I sealed the access panel that day, installing a heavy-duty lock and reinforcing it with metal plating. I hoped that would be the end of it. That night, I decided to stay in the upstairs unit and keep watch. I locked every door and window and set up a makeshift barricade at the top of the stairs. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time they were louder, footsteps, followed by the sound of a door creaking open. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator that someone was in the house. As I waited for the police to arrive, I heard the footsteps move toward the staircase. The silence that followed was crushing, each second stretching into eternity as I braced myself for what might come next. When the police finally arrived, they searched the downstairs unit and found the crawlspace occupant. He was a man in his late 50s, disheveled and unhinged. "I used to live here," he muttered as they escorted him out, his wild, unfocused eyes darting around the room. "This is my home. They can't make me leave." The police told me he had been squatting in the crawlspace for months, possibly even before I bought the property. He'd been sneaking into the downstairs unit at night, careful not to leave too much evidence of his presence. The thought of him living so close, watching me from the shadows, made my stomach churn. I sealed the crawlspace the next day, installing a heavy-duty lock and reinforcing the access panel with metal plating. I also replaced the locks on all the doors and added motion sensors around the property. Despite these precautions, the duplex never felt the same. Every small noise, the floors groaning, the wind shaking the windows, kept my nerves frayed. I couldn't stop worrying that he'd somehow return and find a way back in. Months later, I still feel the unease whenever I'm alone in the house. The duplex was supposed to be a fresh start, a smart investment. Instead, it taught me how fragile our sense of safety can be, even in our own homes. I've started looking for a new place, somewhere far away from Syracuse. Until then, I double-check every lock, every window, and every corner of the house before I go to bed. What haunts me the most is the realization of how long he might have been there. How many nights had I slept peacefully while he moved silently below me? How many times had I been completely unaware of his presence? The duplex was supposed to be a new chapter, but instead, it became a story I'll never forget. And no matter where I go, I'll always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's managed to find another crawl space to call home. Moving to Savannah, Georgia, felt like the culmination of everything my wife, Jade, and I had worked so hard for. We'd saved for years to afford this gorgeous craftsman-style home with a big backyard. From the moment we stepped onto the porch, it felt like home. Jade was already envisioning holiday decorations, and our two kids, Tyler and Zoe, raced around picking their bedrooms. At first, everything went as planned. Met some of the neighbors, settled into our routines, and started enjoying our new life. The kids loved the backyard, and I began tackling small projects around the house to make it ours. But little oddities began to happen about a week after we moved in. At first, they didn't seem like a big deal, but gradually they began to stick out more and more. It started with the knocks. They always came late at night. 3 sharp raps at the front door. I thought it was a prank, maybe some neighborhood kids messing around. I'd go to the door, open it, and find nothing but an empty porch illuminated by the dim glow of the motion sensor light. Jade laughed it off, saying, "It's probably just the wind." But after the 3rd or 4th time, even she started to feel uneasy. Then came the notes. They'd appear on the porch, scraps of paper with cryptic, unsettling messages scrawled in jagged handwriting. Things like, "This house remembers, and you don't belong here." The first time I found one, I crumpled it up and tossed it, thinking it was some kind of weird joke. But they kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. Jade wanted to call the police, but I didn't see the point. What would we say? That someone was leaving creepy notes? It felt silly. The real turning point came one night when Jade woke me up, her voice trembling. "There's someone outside," she whispered. I stumbled out of bed and went to the window. At the edge of our property, near the line of trees, stood a woman. She wore a long coat, and her loose hair framed her face, covering parts of it. She just stood there, staring at the house. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. When the beam of light swept across the yard, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the trees. The next day, I called the previous owner. He was a friendly guy in his late 40s, and during the sale, he'd given me his personal phone number in case we needed anything. When I asked him if he'd ever experienced anything strange while living in the house, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I was hoping she'd leave you alone," he finally said, his voice heavy. "She?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "My ex-wife," he admitted. "She's not well. She was obsessed with the house. Even after the divorce, she refused to accept that it wasn't hers anymore. I'd catch her wandering the property, staring in the windows. It got worse over time. She started leaving notes, messing with the doors and things like that. I'm sorry. I thought selling the house would make her move on." His words sent a chill through me. This wasn't just some random stranger. It was someone with a deep, twisted connection to the house. After that conversation, Jade and I decided to take precautions. We installed security cameras around the property and added stronger locks to the doors and windows. For a while, things seemed to settle down. The knocking stopped, and there were no more notes. But just as we were beginning to relax, the vandalism started. It began with small things, scratches on the front door, plants in the garden uprooted. Then one night, we woke to the sound of shattering glass. A stone had been thrown through the living room window. I rushed outside, but whoever had done it was already gone. In the distance, under the faint glow of a street lamp, I thought I saw a shadow moving away. The next day, we found a note taped to the front door. "Leave, or you'll regret it." Jade was terrified, and for the first time, I started to wonder if we'd made a mistake buying this house. But I couldn't let her win. This was our home now, and I wasn't going to let her scare us out of it. About a week later, things finally crossed the line. It was late and the kids were asleep. Jade and I were in the kitchen when we heard a loud thud against the front door. I grabbed a baseball bat and opened the door to find another note pinned to the wood with a knife. "This house doesn't want you." We called the police that night. When they arrived, we showed them the note and the knife and explained everything that had been happening. They promised to patrol the area more often and took the knife for evidence. A few days later, they caught her. She'd been sneaking around in the alley behind our house, watching the windows. When they arrested her, she was carrying a notebook filled with detailed observations about our family, what times we left the house, when the kids played outside, and even what we ate for dinner. Her obsession had gone far beyond anything we could have imagined. Her arrest should have brought us peace, but her parting words have stayed with us. As the officers led her away, she looked over her shoulder and said, "This house is not yours." Those words haunt me. The kids don't seem to notice, but Jade and I haven't slept well since. We keep the security cameras on 24/7 and check every lock twice before going to bed. Some nights, Jade and I sit in the living room, the curtains drawn tight, and talk about moving. But the idea feels like admitting defeat. We've poured so much into this house, our money, our energy, our dreams. Giving it up feels like letting her win. Still, the sense of safety we once felt is gone, replaced by a constant unease. One evening, while sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, I caught myself looking toward the alley. It was empty, of course, but my mind kept warping reality, painting shadows where there were none. Tyler came out to join me, asking if he could play in the backyard. I hesitated before nodding, realizing just how much her actions had affected us. Even something as simple as letting the kids play outside felt fraught with danger. Sometimes when I'm alone in the house, I feel it. A heaviness, a watchfulness that I can't explain. We're trying to move forward, to reclaim the life we dreamed of when we first bought this house. Jade has started planting flowers in the garden again, and I've been working on fixing the damage to the living room window. But some nights, when the wind blows just right, I think I hear a faint knock at the door, and I wonder if we'll ever truly feel at home again.